I was reading an old article from the BBC recently about a man in Bulgaria, Dinko Valev, who had become known as the migrant hunter. He became famous in 2016 when he subdued a group of Syrian asylum seekers at the border with his bare hands. 12 men, 3 women, and 1 child. Bulgaria needs people like me, dignified Bulgarians willing to defend their homeland, Valev said. These are disgusting and bad people, and they should stay where they are, he continued. Some have called for an investigation into Valev, claiming he bragged on national TV about committing half a dozen hate crimes or other crimes, assault and battery, making death threats, unlawful detention, inciting ethnic hatred, and inciting ethnic violence. Another man who'd been hunting down people even before Valev said, "I was very serious about serving God, the same as all of you. I persecuted people. Some of them were killed because of me. I arrested men and women and put them in jail." Both of these men feared what it would mean if a group different from them became part of their society. I'm not sure what happened to Dinko Valev. From what I could find online, he's gained popularity, fans, and apparently a helicopter. But the story of the second man is one many of us know, and it took a very different turn. It's the story of the Apostle Paul, recounting his life before he became an apostle. Paul had been doing exactly as he said, chasing down and arresting groups of people, which sometimes ended in death. Rather than refugees, Paul was hunting anyone who was a follower of Christ. This group of people, the Way, as he referred to them, threatened everything he knew. Paul was thoroughly educated by the religious elders who taught him their ancient laws and what their views of the world were. He didn't like that these others were adding new pieces to the story, telling people Jesus was the Son of God, that he could forgive sins, that he'd risen from the dead. If they became an accepted part of society, what would that mean for people like Paul? Would some citizens adapt their ways instead of his? Would the elders have to share some of their power and control with people different than them? Rather than trying to imagine how they could coexist, Paul was operating from a fear of the other. So this is what brings Paul out on the road to Damascus, determined to arrest any followers he finds. But in that moment, a bright light comes over him, and he hears a voice asking, "Why do you persecute me?" Paul's then shocked to discover that the voice speaking is none other than Jesus himself, who tells Paul, "Continue on to Damascus and find a man named Ananias, someone who, like Paul, had strictly observed their religious laws." Paul, now blind from the light, had to be taken to the city by his companions so he could meet Ananias, who restored his sight and told him, "The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know God's will, to see the righteous one and hear his own voice, for you will be his witness to all the world of what you have seen and heard." Did anyone catch at what point here Paul became blind? Well, it might seem at first glance that Paul becomes blind when Jesus appears and the light hits him in the eyes. That's how it might sound, but I would actually challenge that notion. I think Paul was blind before any of the events in this story. I think he suffered from confirmation bias, which is the urge to only believe the things that confirm what we believe. If anything, his encounter with Jesus is the moment Paul's eyes finally begin to open. Because at that moment, everything he held to be true hits a brick wall. At that moment, the narrative that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, that Jesus couldn't forgive, and that Jesus hadn't risen, fell apart. Faced with these new facts about the world, Paul realized he had to tell a new story. He had to rewrite the narrative. Can I hear you say rewrite the narrative?
Rewrite the narrative.
Well, that was good, okay. I'd like us to really think about these words today, rewrite the narrative. Because I strongly believe that's where true change in our fight for racial equity begins. Now, if I said someone committed a racist act, what might that look like to you? Anybody? What might an example be?
Swastika on the
A
car.
swastika on a car, yep. Absolutely. Anyone else? Melissa?
Using vulgar language towards somebody or beating them.
Yeah.
Basically.
Physical or verbal abuse towards someone because of their differences, absolutely. For me, for most of my life, that's pretty much how I envisioned racism. White supremacists, racial slurs, inappropriate jokes, or simply a hatred of someone based on the color of their skin. But growing up, these things weren't a part of my world. I was just some white middle-class kid. When I was 13, however, my own road to Damascus experience began. An interracial couple in Milford was being harassed and threatened by their neighbors, and a hate group known as the White Wolves began recruiting throughout the city. The group demonstrated on the green, waving Confederate and Nazi flags. While I knew Milford was hardly an extremely diverse place to live, I didn't think we had issues like this. The story I had told myself about this picture-perfect seaside neighborhood was beginning to fall apart. Also, I didn't know how I could possibly be of any help in a situation like this. Thankfully, the church did. Woodmont UCC and 2 other local churches held a meeting and candlelight vigil shortly after to discern how our community should respond. In an interview with the Associated Press, our former pastor, Reverend Paige Bessie Rankin, said, "We have seen what can happen when hatred is left unchecked and unchallenged. A time when the seeds of hate are planted in our own city is a time to speak out and a time to act." This seemed to echo the famous words of Martin Luther King Jr., who once said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And so after that meeting, the Milford Anti-Hate Task Force was formed, composed of city officials and various members throughout the city of all different faith backgrounds. What united us all was our desire to make the statement that racism and bigotry were not welcome. We counteracted the White Wolves' message of hate with one of love, encouraging local businesses to display stickers that read, "Celebrate diversity." A giant billboard even went up promoting that very message to all who drove by. And we held a festival that celebrated a number of different cultures through their food, their fashion, their music, and just like that, racism disappeared. Well, at least it disappeared to me. You see, the White Wolves left town and I patted myself on the back because we had done a great job. But when your life isn't directly impacted by racism, it can be easy to fall back into comfort and inaction. When the most pressing thing seems like a hate rally, it can be easy to feel like you've finally chased the problem away. For years, I continued to see racism as just those things we mentioned a little while ago. Slurs, jokes, white supremacy. But those are just the in-your-face, hard-to-miss forms of racism. The most sinister kind that I never knew about were subtle, systemic, and part of our everyday lives. If the incident with the White Wolves was the beginning of my road to Damascus experience, the come to Jesus part of it happened when I read a book in seminary called Cut Dead But Still Alive. The title of the book referred to the way in which many African American young men between the ages of 15 and 24 were especially susceptible to feeling muted and invisible by the rest of society. When this happened, their lives often went one of 2 ways. They would fade away and give up into an obscurity, or they would lash out violently at the world, because being noticed for their anger and rage was still preferable to not being noticed at all. From there, I read more books, I watched documentaries, I listened to podcasts, I watched TED Talks, which raised my awareness to a level where I felt physically sick for not knowing how deeply rooted the problem had become. One thing I learned about was the practice of redlining, which is refusing a loan or insurance to someone because they live in an area that's deemed a poor financial risk. Now, poor financial risk is really just another way of saying a little too diverse. This began around the time of the Great Depression, when the federal government literally drew colored lines on maps and shaded some sections of those maps red. And they told the banks it was financially hazardous to lend money in these sections because, as they put it, some areas had been infiltrated by Negroes and immigrants. Other sections of the map were shaded yellow, and banks were warned these areas were declining because they were infiltrated by Jews. This practice finally ended in the 60s when the Fair Housing Act was passed, though. Now, if this is the story we tell, it sounds like some really bad things were done, but the problem was solved. We can tell ourselves there's nothing further to do here. But remember, when we're faced with enough facts, that old narrative doesn't stick. When we ask more questions, we see those colored lines might have physically disappeared off the maps, but those divisions still exist. For example, Zillow did a report on racial disparities in home ownership and found that 1 in 10 whites who applied for a home loan were rejected, but 1 in 4 black applicants were turned down for the same exact loan. Before the last recession hit, the average white home was worth 10 times more than the average black home. And by 2013, that gap had grown to 12.9 times more. But here's the statistic that really blows my mind. It happens when a neighborhood's black population hits 10%.
Ooh.
Does anyone want to guess what happens?
And the houses go down.
At 10%, the homes in that neighborhood decrease in value and continue to decrease as the percentage grows. And what we see here then is white people start to leave. These aren't housing regulations or rules that are causing this phenomenon. Just the fact that at a certain point, white people feel the community no longer conforms to their liking, to their image of it. This applies to neighborhoods regardless of how wealthy or how poor they are, so it is not just a financial thing. Now we can let this be the story that we tell, or we can rewrite. Oh, you guys are good. I wasn't sure if you were going to remember. Exactly, we can rewrite the narrative. If you're white, the new narrative might be a bit scary to embrace when thinking about your financial future. If you found the perfect home and checked off all the boxes on your list, safe neighborhood, great schools, etc., and it was in a more diverse area, would you still purchase it knowing the value would go down as your neighborhood became less white? You don't need to answer, but just ask yourself internally what you might do in that scenario. Recognize that if you are white, you have a special privilege here to live among people who look like you, wherever you want, knowing it won't affect the value of your home. Think about the fact, though, that if enough people, regardless of their skin color, dared to live in these homes now, future generations might not even see that decrease in value. Another narrative I had to change in the story of my life is what I had been told about the 13th Amendment. Now, does anyone here know what the 13th Amendment did? Here's a history question.
Goes away with slavery?
Yes, exactly. The 13th, all right. You get a gold star.
You know other things. No,
The 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's the feel-good version we like to focus on because read this way, it's something we can all rally behind.
Doesn't really.
That's right. Because here's the 13th Amendment again with the section from the middle that I left out. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So what does the additional part tell us? It says, no one shall be a slave or a servant unless you're convicted of a crime. That changes things a little bit, doesn't it? See, after the Civil War, vagrancy laws popped up that forced into employment anyone seen to be wandering around or homeless. If you were a newly freed slave and didn't trust you'd find honest work with your former master, guess what you were probably doing? Wandering around, looking for other work or looking for family that you had lost. But local authorities could now arrest freed slaves for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor. And if someone tried to run away from this forced labor, they were sentenced to working for free with a ball and chain attached to them. These prisoners became part of the convict leasing system that leased out prisoners, most of whom were black, to private third parties. And eventually these vagrancy laws did go away, but those in power again found ways to control and limit the influence of black people when Jim Crow laws took effect in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These we know well as laws that enforce racial segregation throughout the South. Today we celebrate people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and countless others who fought to restore basic human rights to black people throughout our country. Rights like voting, proper wages, and access to the same quality services that whites were given. The story we like to tell ends there. We like to explain how these horrible laws and practices were put away for good. But again, when listening to new details, that story begins to fall apart. Today we're living through what many are calling the new Jim Crow. The war on drugs that began with President Nixon and escalated with other presidencies following it decimated whole communities of African Americans, labeling them felons for what many consider today to be minor infractions. While in prison, they again became cheap labor to be leased out to third parties. And after prison, they lose the right to vote, the right to serve on a jury, protection from job and housing discrimination, and the list goes on and on. We tell ourselves that we send people to prison to serve out their sentences for a specific period of time. But the reality is, we seem to make sure they're somehow sentenced for life. By training ourselves to see dangerous patterns that keep recurring through history, perhaps we can find ways to snuff them out whenever they begin again. If we want change, we have to start telling a different story. We have to rewrite the narrative. Perhaps what that means today is speaking out against mass incarceration, pushing for new laws, and fighting to help reformed prisoners regain those basic human rights. As the sermon approaches its conclusion, there are a few final things I want to touch on. First, I'd like to ask ourselves what role the church plays in enforcing the idea that whiteness is the norm and anything else needs explaining. For example, when you looked at the cover of today's bulletin, did anything jump out to you? Yeah, right? We have an African-American Jesus on the cover of the bulletin. And if I'm being honest, that caught my eye too. But as we know, Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jew and wouldn't necessarily have looked exactly like this, or the typical white European Jesus that we're used to seeing, sometimes blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Yet the cover image seems foreign to us. But the other version, we wouldn't bat an eye at. We would just take it, yeah, that's Jesus. When we celebrate communion each month, what color is the juice? Purple. Purplish, reddish. Why is it that color? What does it represent?
Blood.
Blood, right. It's a reddish, purplish color because it represents blood. What color is the bread?
White.
Why is it that color? Got you on that one. It's a little harder to justify. Think about the words that are said up here during the sacrament of communion. This is my body, broken for you. The Reverend Davida McAllister asked some very powerful questions about this subject. She said, how difficult would it be to imagine a Middle Eastern body broken in order to save a whitened world? How would it change the way we look at black and brown bodies if we had to consume them during worship? What if World Communion Sunday was the only day to witness a white Christ in the loaf? Now, I promise I'm wrapping this up because I have enough sense to know there's a fine line between a long sermon and a hostage situation. But honestly, it kills me that there are so many modern-day issues around racial equality that I didn't have room to include. How many testimonies and unspoken problems had to be left out on the cutting room floor? What do we do? Leave them there to be forgotten? Or do we pick them up and say, we need to keep this conversation going? If you'd like to join me in continuing these discussions and explore ways in which we can become allies in the fight for equality, there are slips in your bulletins that you can fill out and place in the offering plates when they're passed around. Look over the options and, well, there's only one option. It's the social justice group that we're starting. So if that's something that interests you, fill out your name, fill out your email. And let's keep these conversations going, because there is so much more to talk about. But if you're like me, and you're white and thinking, what gives me the right to speak out about racism? I haven't been a victim. I mean, who am I to speak out about being oppressed if I haven't felt those things myself? I'd point you back to our good friend, the Apostle Paul. You remember Paul. He didn't have the best credentials either. Here's a man who went from capturing anyone who followed Christ to proclaiming the good news himself. There were certainly a lot of people who would have said, why the heck should we trust you? Who are you to tell us about Christ? Paul understood what it meant to be an ally. Even though he didn't share in the same experiences as those who traveled with Christ, he knew the world needed to hear their message. And he understood that his position and his status as a Roman citizen gave him privileges and audiences that the others might not have access to. The same goes for all of us. Being an ally doesn't mean remaining quiet because of your privilege. It means using your privilege to give a voice to those who have been silenced and to provide opportunities for them to share their stories. For those of us who aren't white, it can be hard to let new voices enter the conversation. The policies and the changes to our society need to come from those who have felt the harmful impact of what is currently in place. But I truly believe we're strongest when we work together as one. Earlier in the service, I mentioned how the slaves found strength and comfort in the story of Moses and the Hebrew people's exodus from bondage. Dr. King made a great point about that story. He noticed that when Pharaoh wanted to control people, he simply turned them against one another. Because if they were too busy fighting against each other, they couldn't possibly fight him. But when people came together as one, they were unstoppable. Together we can shed more light on the story we've been telling and show people that it doesn't work anymore. Together we can rewrite the narrative. Amen, church?
Amen.